The city had always prided itself on its order: clean streets, shining towers, a police force that boasted of justice through vigilance. But beneath the neon glow and the illusion of safety, something festering had long taken root. The kind of rot that didn't make noise but left its mark in quiet sobs behind closed doors, in case files that gathered dust, and in the eyes of those who had learned not to hope. Daniel Cross had once believed in that system. For 15 years he had worn the badge, stood behind the shield, and convinced himself that justice was a matter of patience, that the law might crawl, but it always reached the finish line. Until the day it didn't. Her name was Emily, his daughter. 14 years old, bright, curious, the kind of girl who still believed that the world was a place where good people won. And then one night, she didn't come home. It took 2 days to find her, and by then, there wasn't much left to find. The man responsible, a known predator, already accused in 3 other cases, walked free 6 months later. Insufficient evidence, the judge said. Improper procedure, the defense claimed. Daniel had watched from the courtroom as the man smirked at him on his way out. That smirk burned into his soul like acid. Something broke inside him that day. The part that wore the badge. The part that waited for the system to work. The part that believed in the slow grind of justice. What replaced it wasn't rage, not entirely. It was a clarity sharper than a knife, a purpose stripped of morality and hesitation. He left the force quietly, signed the papers, handed in his weapon. No one asked why. They saw a grieving father and assumed he wanted peace. They didn't know he'd already started planning. It began with the files, hundreds of them, all the men who had walked away from their crimes on technicalities or through influence. He knew how to find them, knew where the holes were in the system because he had spent his career patching them. He learned their patterns, watched them from afar. He built a map of monsters living ordinary lives. And when he was ready, he went hunting. His first target was the man who killed Emily. He found him in a rundown apartment 2 cities away, working under a false name. Daniel waited 3 weeks, studying his habits, memorizing his routine. When he finally acted, it wasn't impulsive. It was methodical. The man disappeared one night after work. His body was found a week later, buried in a shallow grave near an abandoned quarry. The police called it a drug-related killing. No one looked deeper. Daniel didn't stop. The next was a child trafficker who had evaded conviction through witness intimidation. Then a rapist whose lawyer had torn apart a terrified woman's testimony. Each one vanished quietly, and with each disappearance, the city's predators began to whisper of a ghost, someone who knew their names, their haunts, their sins. The papers called him the Night Shepherd. Social media made him a legend, half myth, half messiah. Some called him evil. Others called him the only justice left. But Daniel didn't care about names. He wasn't saving anyone. He was erasing stains. At first, he kept a code. He only went after those proven guilty, even if the courts had failed to punish them. But obsession has a way of blurring lines. Soon, suspicion became enough. Rumor became reason. A man accused became a man condemned. Daniel began to trust his instincts more than evidence, his nightmares more than facts. And that was when the mistakes began. There was the teacher accused of misconduct who had been cleared after the student admitted to lying. There was the ex-con trying to rebuild his life, who happened to live near a recent assault site. Daniel's methods didn't leave room for second chances. Justice was swift and final. The police, once baffled, began to connect the dots. His old partner, Detective Karen Vega, was the first to see the pattern, the choice of victims, the forensic precision, the timing. She knew Daniel too well. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just looked at her with the hollow calm of a man past redemption. "You were supposed to be better than this," she said. "I was," he replied. "But the law isn't." She tried to stop him, begged him to turn himself in, but he only smiled, a weary, broken smile. "You'll find me when it's done." That was the last time anyone saw him in daylight. Over the next year, the killings continued, but they changed. The victims grew less clear-cut, the motives less pure. Vigilance had turned to hunger, a need to hunt, to cleanse, to prove that the system's decay could only be cured by fire. Daniel had become what he once despised, a predator who believed himself righteous. It ended on a rain-soaked night behind a motel on the city's edge. A police sting gone right for once. Vega waited in the dark, gun steady, as Daniel approached another intended victim, a man who, as it turned out, was undercover. The two locked eyes, years of history between them. "You don't have to do this," Vega said, stepping into the light. Daniel looked at her, rain dripping from his hair, his eyes tired but unafraid. "The law failed, Karen. I just finished what it couldn't. You became the thing you were fighting." He hesitated, just for a heartbeat, and then lowered his weapon. For the first time in years, he looked unsure. When he was taken away, the city felt quieter. The papers wrote their headlines. Some called him a murderer, others a hero. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the sirens faded and the streets lay empty, there were still those who swore they heard whispers, that the night shepherd's work wasn't done, that others had taken up his cause. And somewhere in a concrete cell, Daniel Cross sat alone, eyes closed, hearing the echo of his daughter's laughter in the darkness. He smiled faintly, not from peace, but from the cruel understanding that justice, real justice, had never been about right or wrong. It had always been about who could endure the pain long enough to deliver it. The trial of Daniel Cross became the most watched spectacle the city had seen in decades. Every news outlet turned it into a morality play. The father turned executioner, the cop who crossed the line, the vigilante who became a monster. Protesters filled the courthouse steps, half holding signs that read "Justice for the Forgotten," the other half demanding no one above the law. The world wanted to decide whether he was a savior or a killer. Daniel didn't care either way. He sat through the proceedings in silence, never raising his voice, never defending his actions. When asked why he did it, he answered simply, "Because the system taught me how." The prosecutors called it arrogance. The defense tried to paint him as broken by grief. The truth was somewhere between, a man hollowed out by a world that punished innocence and rewarded manipulation. Detective Vega testified against him, her voice steady but heavy with guilt. She told the court how Daniel used police databases, old case files, confidential evidence, how he had turned the tools of justice into weapons of vengeance. But when the prosecutor asked her if she believed he was evil, she hesitated. "No," she said finally. "I believe he started as good. That's what makes it worse." The jury found him guilty of 13 counts of murder, though investigators suspected there were many more. When the judge read the sentence, life without parole, Daniel only nodded. He didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He just looked at the courtroom, at the families of the victims, at the faces twisted in either anger or gratitude, and said, "You're welcome." Inside prison, he was both feared and revered. Some inmates called him the preacher, others the reaper. Even the guards treated him with a wary respect. Rumors spread that he helped expose a pedophile ring among the inmates, that he took notes on who didn't belong there, the ones who preyed on others even behind bars. One night, a guard found a prisoner beaten nearly to death in the showers, a piece of paper pinned to his chest, for Emily. No one could prove Daniel's involvement, but no one doubted it either. The warden had him moved to solitary for his own safety, though everyone knew it was for the safety of others. In isolation, the silence became his companion. Days melted into nights without distinction. He spent hours remembering details of his daughter's laughter, the sound of her sneakers on the kitchen floor, the way she used to braid his hair as a joke. Sometimes he spoke to her as if she were still there, whispering apologies she could never hear. Other times he wrote letters, hundreds of them, to the families of the men he killed. Some he mailed, most he didn't. One letter made it outside. It was to Vega. It read, "You were right. I became what I hated. But tell me, Karen, how many more girls like Emily have died while I've been locked away? How many more predators walk free because of a loophole, a signature, a deal? I may have been wrong in my way, but I was not wrong in my cause. The law doesn't stop evil. It only slows it down long enough for it to find another victim." Vega never replied, but she kept the letter. Months turned into years. The world outside moved on. A new mayor, a new police chief, new headlines to feed the public's appetite for outrage. But something strange began to happen. Across the country, copycat cases emerged, men found dead under similar circumstances, all with criminal pasts that had escaped conviction. Each crime scene bore Daniel's mark, a white feather left beside the body. The police dismissed it as coincidence, then as myth. But Vega knew better. She received an anonymous envelope one morning with no return address. Inside was a single feather and a note. Justice doesn't die, it evolves. She traced the paper, the handwriting, precise, deliberate, too careful to belong to Daniel himself, but eerily familiar. Someone was continuing his work. Or perhaps many someones. The public's fascination reignited. Documentaries were made, podcasts dissected every detail, journalists debated whether the Night Shepherd was truly gone. Some believed Daniel was secretly released by the government to handle unofficial cases. Others claimed he had inspired an underground network of vigilantes who operated where the law refused to tread. But in the quiet hours of her sleepless nights, Vega wondered if Daniel had planned it all. Not just the killings, but the legacy. The idea that justice could belong to anyone who dared to take it. He had always been methodical, always 10 steps ahead. Perhaps he had never intended to stop. In his cell, Daniel's hair had turned white. His face was lined with time, his body frail, but his eyes still sharp. When a new inmate arrived, a young man with the same haunted look Daniel once wore, they spoke through the cracks in the cell door. The boy's sister had been assaulted, her attacker released on bail. The boy said he wanted to make things right. Daniel didn't tell him not to. He simply said, "If you do this, you stop being you. Make sure that's what you want." That night, the boy was gone. Released early, transferred, no one knew. But 2 months later, a body turned up in another city. A known predator, executed in the same ritualistic fashion. When Vega read the report, she closed her eyes and sighed. The ghost of Daniel Cross had become something larger than one man, an idea that couldn't be arrested, couldn't be caged. The Night Shepherd had become a movement, born from the cracks in the very justice system that claimed to keep order. Daniel died in his sleep a year later. The guards found him peaceful, almost smiling. On his cell wall, scratched faintly into the concrete, were the words, "When the law fails, conscience must answer." They buried him without ceremony in an unmarked grave beyond the prison yard. But even after his death, the killings didn't stop. The feathers kept appearing, and somewhere out there, in the spaces where justice gives way to fear, the predators still whisper the same name before they sleep, not out of hatred, but of dread. The Night Shepherd, the one who comes when the law looks away. Years passed, and the world changed, as it always does. But the story of Daniel Cross, the vigilante once called the Night Shepherd, never faded. It lived on in murmurs, in the deep corners of online forums, in alleyway legends, in the trembling voices of men who had too much to hide. It became less a story of one man and more a warning. Justice had learned how to bleed back. Detective Karen Vega retired 5 years after Daniel's death. She moved to a quiet coastal town, bought a house that smelled of salt and rain, and told herself she was done chasing ghosts. But ghosts have a way of finding those who remember them. Every few months, she'd receive an envelope, no return address, always sealed with a single white feather. Sometimes it came with an old case file, other times a photo of a missing girl, or a name scribbled on the back of a napkin. The message was always the same: the shepherd watches. Vega never spoke of it publicly. She'd burned some of the letters, buried others. Yet a part of her couldn't help but read them all, trying to decide whether this was justice continuing or vengeance that had learned to disguise itself. In one envelope, she found a USB drive. The files inside were meticulous: maps, surveillance footage, criminal records. It was exactly the kind of thing Daniel used to compile. But the timestamps were recent. The last video showed a man being dragged into an abandoned warehouse, crying, begging. Vega stopped watching before the end. She shut off her computer, but the sound of his voice haunted her for days. The police never traced the source. But Vega didn't need them to. She knew someone had inherited Daniel's doctrine, perhaps one of his followers, perhaps someone who had merely believed too deeply in his cause. The Shepherd Network, the media began calling them. No one knew if it was one person or 100. The FBI called them terrorists. The public called them heroes. In the underworld, they were a nightmare. Child traffickers vanished without trace. Corrupt officials resigned under mysterious pressure. A judge known for taking bribes was found hanging in his mansion with a white feather in his hand. Each act was surgical, impossible to predict. Law enforcement agencies found themselves chasing a shadow born from their own failures. And in the heart of it all, Vega began to see the pattern, a morality code written in the same cold logic Daniel had lived by. Each victim was someone the system had failed to punish. Each crime was marked by precision, discipline, and silence. There was no chaos, no cruelty for pleasure. Only retribution. It was as if Daniel's ghost had organized the chaos he once embodied, turned vengeance into structure, a new kind of justice that operated beyond the law. Then one day, she received something different. Another envelope. But this time, instead of a feather, it contained a photograph, an old one, faded around the edges. It was Daniel, years before everything fell apart, standing beside Emily at a fairground. He was smiling, genuinely smiling, his arm around her shoulders. On the back of the photo were 5 words written in neat, deliberate script. He gave us purpose, Karen. Vega stared at it for a long time, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Grief, guilt, fear, maybe all of them. She had spent her career trying to believe in the system, to believe that even when it faltered, it could still be repaired. But the letters, the photos, the whispers, they all told a different truth. The law hadn't been mended, it had been replaced. The world adapted to the myth. Politicians condemned the vigilantes in public, but used their existence to promise reform. Crime rates dropped in certain cities, but not because of better policing, because fear had become law. In dark corners, criminals spoke of Shepherd's judgment, a phrase that meant an invisible hand was always watching. Some fled the country. Some changed their names. Others took their own lives before the Shepherd could reach them. But not everyone applauded the silence. There were stories, hidden, quickly buried, of innocents caught in the crossfire, mistaken identities, lives erased because someone's algorithm, or someone's instinct, thought they were guilty. The machine Daniel had inspired no longer had a heart to question itself. One night, Vega sat by the sea, the waves black under a starless sky. The news played faintly in the background. Another politician found dead, another feather discovered. She thought of Daniel, of Emily, of the look in his eyes that last night before his arrest. Not rage, not triumph, just exhaustion. She whispered into the wind, as though he could still hear her. Is this what you wanted, Daniel? A world afraid to sin, or a world too afraid to breathe? The waves gave no answer. But far away, in a city of glass and shadows, a man in a hood watched through the scope of his rifle as his target entered a penthouse. He checked his watch, exhaled slowly, and reached into his pocket. From it, he pulled a small white feather and tucked it into his glove. Justice, he murmured to himself, doesn't rest. He squeezed the trigger, and in that single, distant sound, a crack swallowed by the hum of the city, the legacy of Daniel Cross lived on. Because once the law fails, it never truly regains its power. It leaves behind something else, something older, colder, and far more relentless. It leaves behind the shepherds. Predator's worst nightmare. Justice, reborn in shadow.